Look at popular media, and you might assume Rome sustained itself strictly through brute force, relying on endless columns of heavy infantry to beat the ancient world into submission. But history is full of armies that conquered rapidly and fractured almost immediately. Alexander the Great pushed his borders all the way to the Indian subcontinent in just 7 summers, yet his empire splintered upon his death. Less than a century was all it took for the Mongols to sweep from the Sea of China to the forests of Germany. Holding that immense territory together was another matter entirely. This map shows the Roman Empire during the age of the Antonines in the 2nd century AD. It spans 3 continents and millions of square miles, a territorial footprint they maintained for hundreds of years. The sword could draw the initial borders, but it could not hold them for centuries. Rome endured because they engineered a precise system of social technology, a mechanism designed to take the people they had just conquered and turn them into active stakeholders in the empire. A massive territory means massive diversity. Governing millions of subjects who spoke different languages and worshipped different local deities created a constant risk of cultural rebellion. The average citizen genuinely believed in the absolute truth of their local gods, while the educated philosophers generally viewed all of these pantheons as equally false. But the government officials, the magistrates, had a third perspective. They viewed every single religion as equally useful for maintaining civic order. The polytheistic system was highly flexible. When Romans encountered a foreign deity, they simply matched them to a similar figure in their own mythology, eliminating theological friction between the conqueror and the conquered. They even adopted the local protectors of vanquished cities. Rome regularly invited foreign gods into their own pantheon, turning the capital into a common temple for the entire known world. This was cold, calculated statecraft, not a modern ideal of universal rights. Tolerance remained absolute, right up until a religious practice threatened the machinery of the state. When a specific sect crossed the line into disrupting civil law, the Roman legions moved in to dismantle it with ruthless efficiency. The Druids in the province of Gaul learned this firsthand. Under the pretext of abolishing human sacrifice, a practice Rome considered a dangerous disruption to public order, the emperors Tiberius and Claudius systematically crushed the Druid power base. By treating the spiritual world as an open, flexible marketplace, Rome removed religious resentment from the equation. They purchased earthly obedience through spiritual indulgence. The second lever of control was demographic. In the ancient world, powerful city-states traditionally hoarded citizenship, terrified of diluting the pure blood of their original founders. That exclusivity was a fatal flaw. Cultural centers like Athens and Sparta saw their citizen numbers gradually dwindle, weakening their military capacity and accelerating their collapse. Rome prioritized ambition over vanity. They actively granted legal status to strangers, former enemies, and capable barbarians. This chart visualizes the Roman Republic's early strength, starting with a baseline census of 83,000 citizens capable of bearing arms. By the Social War, that number multiplied to over 463,000 men, massively expanding their military capacity by absorbing surrounding populations. The system did experience friction. The rapid expansion of Roman influence meant their Italian allies eventually demanded an equal share of those legal privileges, even taking up arms to force the issue. Instead of fighting an endless war of attrition to keep their neighbors locked out, the Roman Senate simply yielded. They granted the demands and formally absorbed the Italian states into the Republic. By promoting the conquered into the ranks of the conquerors, Rome maintained a reservoir of loyal manpower that allowed the state to scale its military strength, even as its geographic responsibilities increased. By the age of the Antonines, these policies had produced a unified territory where once hostile subjects shared a single legal code and a clear pathway to Roman status. Rome maintained its scale for centuries by choosing to distribute its most valuable legal privileges to the very people it brought under its control. The empire operated on a highly practical trade. Conquered populations paid taxes and obeyed civil authorities. In return, they kept their ancestral gods and gained a clear clapwray to political equality. Empires that rely entirely on the superiority of their own culture and the endless threat of military force become brittle. When pressure builds, they shatter under the weight of their rigid borders. The empire persisted because it engineered a system of shared identity that consistently pulled foreign populations into the fold, turning potential enemies into its primary stakeholders. This is a map of the Roman Empire at its absolute peak, during the 2nd century under the Antonine emperors. The borders stretched from the rainy, forested frontiers of Britain all the way to the deep, sun-baked deserts of Egypt. When the historian Edward Gibbon looked back at the census data recorded by Emperor Claudius, he calculated a staggering figure. Under this single government lived roughly 120 million human beings. This chart shows that total population scaling up to the 120 million mark. Compared to the populations of France and Germany during Gibbon's own era, the Roman figure easily dwarfs them. These 120 million people were not a monolithic crowd of toga-wearing citizens. They existed within a deeply fractured, highly stratified social landscape. To understand how the Pax Romana survived without tearing itself apart, we must look past the marble monuments and dissect this demographic hierarchy from top to bottom. At the top of the pyramid sat Italy and its native-born citizens. They functioned as the protected, tax-exempt core of the empire, shielded from the arbitrary legal power of provincial governors. To project this influence outward, Rome established colonies in the provinces and granted them the right of latium. This legal status conferred partial citizenship and exempted a city from the heavy hand of a Roman prefect. This mechanism acted as an incentive. If local magistrates served their annual terms and assimilated into the Roman system, they were rewarded with full Roman citizenship at the end of their office. The data shows how well this worked. The grandsons of the same Celtic Gauls who fought Julius Caesar eventually adopted formal Latin civic titles, governed wealthy provinces, and took seats in the Roman Senate. Rome's most effective imperial technology was the calculated distribution of legal rights, designed to bind the wealthiest provincials directly to the capital. This map illustrates a cultural fault line running through the empire, dividing the population into two distinct spheres, the Latin West and the Greek East. The western provinces, places like Spain, Gaul, and Britain, acted as a blank slate. Local populations traded their native Celtic idioms for Latin, as it was the clearest path to social and political advancement. The eastern provinces were different. An entrenched Greek culture viewed the Romans as unpolished conquerors and refused to abandon its language. Rome struck a compromise. They allowed Greek to remain the natural language of science and literature, while strictly enforcing Latin as the exclusive dialect for all civil and military administration. The empire relied on this dual-system approach, enforcing cultural uniformity in the West, while tolerating a subordinate cultural identity in the East. At the bottom of this demographic pyramid, roughly half of the entire Roman world, about 60 million people, lived in permanent slavery. Initially, this workforce was made up of barbarian captives, taken by the hundreds of thousands during the empire's expansionist wars. Once the borders settled, the empire pivoted to a slower method of population growth, encouraging enslaved families to multiply internally to maintain the workforce. This captive population was the economic backbone of Roman society. Their labor drove agricultural output and subsidized the luxurious lifestyles of the urban elite. Emperors like Hadrian and Marcus Aurelius passed laws to stop masters from arbitrarily murdering enslaved people, primarily to protect a valuable economic asset. The prosperity of the Antonine Age was the result of subsidizing citizen luxury through the permanent subjugation of 60 million human beings. The tax-exempt elites, the culturally managed provincials, and the massive enslaved base operated together as a single interdependent machine. Rome achieved this stability by balancing the allure of legal assimilation with the enforcement of absolute social control. This forces us to re-examine the legacy of the Antonine Age and the danger of admiring ancient peace without looking closely at the data beneath it. The Roman Empire stands as historical proof that a society can indeed achieve immense scale and lasting stability, provided it is willing to institutionalize profound human inequality. When we picture the machinery of an ancient empire, we usually imagine a brutal reality. We picture legions marching through occupied streets, tax collectors backed by swords, and garrisons desperately holding down rebellious provinces. But look at the Roman world during the age of the Antonines, and you find a strange anomaly. Across a massive stretch of territory, from the banks of the Thames all the way to the Nile, the civil magistrate almost never needed military backup. The legions were stationed out on the frontiers, facing external enemies. In the heart of the empire, they were virtually invisible. The people living in these provinces weren't actively plotting their independence. They didn't even view their own existence as distinct from Rome. Gallic farmers and Greek merchants considered themselves part of one unified public. Curious, how do you keep millions of people, spread across dozens of distinct cultures, perfectly obedient without a standing army watching their every move? The logistics of maintaining that kind of control through pure intimidation are impossible. The Roman state didn't rely on intimidation. They secured their conquests using a completely different mechanism of control. Their ultimate weapon for securing loyalty was architecture. It started at the very top. Emperors like Augustus wielded unimaginable wealth, but rather than hoarding it, they poured it into massive civic projects. They built theaters, baths, and porticos intended entirely for public benefit. You can see this strategy perfectly preserved in the Capitol. This towering marble pillar is Trajan's Column. It anchored a massive public forum where common citizens could walk through the empire's successes. Looking closely, the surface is covered with an exact representation of victories in Dacia. A veteran looking at these carvings could point out his own campaigns, while a peaceful civilian felt intimately tied to the triumph of the state. It was an illusion of shared national glory, carved in stone. This wasn't limited to Rome itself. We see emperors like Hadrian, immortalized in this marble bust, physically traveling to the edges of the empire. He didn't just order the construction of new monuments in the provinces, he personally inspected their progress, treating the arts as a direct extension of imperial authority. This top-down mandate triggered a powerful reaction among the empire's elite. Wealthy subjects quickly realized that the fastest way to acquire social status was to mimic the emperor. They began pouring their own personal fortunes into civic improvements. Take an Athenian citizen named Herodes Atticus. His father had discovered an immense treasure buried under an old house. When they offered it to the emperor Nerva, the emperor refused to take it, telling them to use it for themselves. Atticus took that advice to heart by spending nearly all of it on the public. The scale of these private gifts is hard to comprehend. This is the Panathenaic Stadium in Athens, a structure 600 feet long, built entirely of white marble by Herodes Atticus. He financed the whole thing, creating a venue capable of holding the entire voting population of the city. He didn't stop there. He restored this massive theater, the Odeum, dedicating it to his wife. In the Roman system, hoarding money gave you nothing. Staggering private wealth only became politically useful when it was converted into a permanent public gift. That obsession with civic building soon evolved from a personal ambition into a collective one. Entire municipalities started fighting with each other, using infrastructure as their ammunition. Look at the explosion of development across Gaul. Over 1,000 cities sprang up or modernized, and places like Nimes built massive, freestanding arenas like this one. They were intentionally copying the wealth and elegance of central Italy, dropping miniature colosseums directly into the provinces. The cultural pressure reached all the way to the dense woods of the British frontier. Forests were cleared to make way for York and London, and here in Bath, the natural hot springs were enclosed in elegant masonry, transforming a rugged outpost into a sophisticated medicinal retreat. In the older established provinces of the East, the competition was even fiercer. Cities like Ephesus, Smyrna, and Pergamus waged decades-long battles over the titular primacy of Asia. They weaponized their wealth to build ornate monuments, like the multi-tiered facade of the Library of Celsus here in Ephesus, just to outshine their neighbors. Even smaller cities got pulled into the arms race. We see the remains of Laodicea scattered here across the hills. To stay relevant against the heavyweights, they channeled revenues from their famous wool trade and a massive legacy left by a single generous citizen straight into grand civic structures. The emperors managed to Romanize the known world without draining the central treasury. Conquered cities were so eager to prove their status that they bankrupted themselves doing the work of the state for them. When you zoom out, The geographic result of this chain reaction is staggering. A unified network of standardized infrastructure radiates out of Rome, sparking across Gaul, Britain, North Africa, and deep into Asia. The entire Mediterranean basin was bound together by shared civic spaces. While theaters and temples occupied the public's leisure, the aqueduct secured their survival. It provided a life-sustaining benefit, a constant stream of fresh water, to regions that had been barren for centuries. And they were engineered for maximum visual impact. Take the aqueduct of Segovia, rising above the town square. The heavy stone construction is a display of permanence. Standing beneath these pillars, your worldview shifts. It is difficult to plot rebellion against the state providing your drinking water. Compare this to the monarchies of Asia at the time. They relied on despotism in the center and weak hereditary satraps in the provinces. They enforced tax collection and justice with a constant military presence. The result was a population always inclined to rebel. But Rome chose to engineer voluntary obedience. These majestic ruins scattered across Europe and the sweeping walls of the Colosseum stand as the physical fossil record of a highly successful political assimilation machine. The age of the Antonines demonstrates a specific lesson in statecraft. An empire persists when its subjects find it more rewarding to emulate their conquerors than to fight them. If you were to start at the defensive walls of northern Britain and travel southeast, you could walk continuously to the city of Jerusalem. During the age of the Antonine emperors, this unbroken chain of communication stretched exactly 4,080 miles. These public highways ran in direct lines from city to city, largely ignoring the obstacles of nature. Roman engineers threw bold, solid stone arches over rapid streams, paving the raised terraces with granite to ensure they would outlast the centuries. To weaponize this network, the imperial government built post houses every 5 miles along the routes. Because of these constant relays, a traveler could easily cover 100 miles in a day. This infrastructure rendered the entire empire pervious to the arms and authority of the conqueror. By bridging the gap between distant provinces, Rome effectively shrunk the known world, fusing disparate territories into a single, efficient machine. The protection of this established government sparked an agricultural explosion. Crops that were once confined to the east, apricots, peaches, and the olive, followed the progress of peace westward. Soon, the intensive cultivation of vineyards and flax was naturalized in the heart of Gaul and Spain. With the Mediterranean acting as a massive central lake, Rome ransacked the edges of the map to supply a booming luxury market. Amber arrived from the Baltic shores, while highly prized Babylonian carpets flowed in from the east. This map visualizes the immense scale of the resulting trade deficit. Every year, fleets departed Egypt to cross the ocean to the coast of Malabar and Ceylon. In exchange for precious pearls, silks, and aromatics, Roman subjects surrendered enormous sums of their own silver to hostile nations in Arabia and India. But if we look inside the empire's borders, this massive outflow of wealth barely dented the domestic economy. Robust internal circulation, supported by intense new mining operations, kept the political machine humming. If a harvest failed in one province, the surplus of a fortunate neighbor immediately relieved it. Famines practically disappeared. On paper, this was an absolute utopia. The citizens enjoyed a long festival of peace in a landscape cultivated like an immense garden. Yet the people living inside it were totally blind to the fact that this flawless stability was injecting a slow and secret poison straight into the vitals of the empire. We have to look past the physical wealth of the Antonine age to understand what this comfortable, frictionless machine was actually doing to the human mind. The historically brave and robust citizens of Europe had quietly traded their independence for total safety. Instead of governing themselves, they received all of their laws and direction directly from the will of a distant, centralized sovereign. Without the immediate presence of danger, public courage evaporated. The population completely outsourced its defense to a mercenary army, losing the sense of national honor and the daily habit of command that had built the republic in the first place. The posterity of Europe's boldest leaders settled into the role of citizens and subjects. Completely deprived of political responsibility or the need to struggle, the provinces simply sank into the languid indifference of private life. This apathy bled directly from the military into the intellectual world. The Antonines generously funded schools across the great cities, maintaining professors of rhetoric and philosophy at the public expense, yet the fire of genius was entirely extinguished. Despite its vast wealth, its universal education, and its total peace, this era of indolence passed without producing a single writer of original genius. The title of orator was usurped by performing sophists. A cloud of critics, compilers, and commentators darkened the face of learning. Instead of generating new ideas, they offered blind deference to ancient Greek masters, producing nothing but cold, servile imitations of past greatness. In the schools, the systems of the ancient masters were transmitted with blind deference from one generation to the next. This uniform, artificial education favored cold and servile imitation, precluding any attempt to enlarge the limits of the human mind. The uniform, highly administered system that successfully eliminated famine had simultaneously sterilized human thought. The ancient philosopher Longinus, working slightly later, recognized this silent decay. He delivered a devastating diagnosis of what it meant to live under this perfect, managed peace. Longinus observed that just as binding an infant's limbs stunts physical growth, the tender minds of the citizens had been tightly fettered by just servitude. Unable to expand themselves, the population was slowly sinking below the old standard, breeding an intellectual and civic race of pygmies. Waiting outside the borders of this highly cultivated terrarium were the fierce giants of the north, the robust, warlike barbarian tribes. When those tribes eventually broke in, they shattered the artificial limits of the Roman world. Brutal as the collapse was, the total destruction of the imperial safety net forced the surviving population to take responsibility for its own defense again, ultimately restoring a manly, vigorous spirit of freedom to Europe. The paradox of the Antonine Age stands as a warning. It proves that humanity's greatest threat isn't always poverty or war. Sometimes the deadliest trap is a perfectly secure, frictionless golden age.